The snow had been falling since Tuesday. By Friday morning it lay in thick, unbroken sheets across the sidewalks of Millhaven, Ohio. A town small enough that the plows came late and the cold came early, and the people who lived there had long since made their peace with both. The street lamps were still burning at 6 o'clock, doing almost nothing against the dark, casting circles of amber light onto the white ground below that made the whole street look like the inside of a snow globe. Someone had shaken and sat down and forgotten about. Daniel Carter had been awake since 5. He always was. The alarm was set for 5:15, but he'd stopped needing it sometime around the second year, after Claire left back, when Lily was only 2 years old, and sleep had become something that happened in chunks, between nighttime coughing fits and bad dreams about bills. These days Lily slept fine. She slept better than most adults he knew. Rolled up in her flannel blankets with one sock always off by morning, and her yellow stuffed rabbit pressed against her chin. It was Daniel who woke early, who lay in the gray pre-dawn quiet listening to the radiator knock, running the numbers in his head the way other men ran laps. Rent was $460. Due the 15th. He had $312. The Carver job, a full brake replacement, plus a busted tie rod on an F-150, would pay him $280 if Marcus paid on time. Which Marcus sometimes did, and sometimes didn't. There was a water pump job lined up for Wednesday, pending the part, which was supposed to arrive from Columbus but had been pending for 11 days, and was beginning to feel like it might be pending indefinitely. The transmission rebuild was 2 weeks out at least. He had Lily's school lunch account to refill $17, and the electric bill that had gone up because the insulation in the bedroom walls was old and thin, and January in Ohio was not a month that forgave pour insulation. He got out of bed before the numbers could get worse. The kitchen in the apartment on Fenwick Street was narrow enough that a grown man could touch both walls if he stretched his arms out, which Daniel had done exactly once, on the day they moved in a spirit of dark comedy that had since become something closer to resignation. He made oatmeal on the 2-burner stove. He made it the way Lily liked it, with a spoonful of brown sugar and a handful of raisins, and portioned hers into a bowl he set on the back of the stove to stay warm. He poured coffee into a thermos. He zipped himself into his canvas work coat, the one with the torn left pocket he kept meaning to sew closed. And he picked up the paper bag he'd packed the night before. The bag had 2 things in it: a foil-wrapped breakfast sandwich from the place on Clement Street that did early hours for the factory workers, egg and cheese, and a slice of Canadian bacon, kept warm in their foil, and a small cup of black coffee with a lid. He bought these 4 mornings out of 5, spending $4.25 each time on food he did not eat himself, because 6 months ago he had walked past bus stop 14 on his way to the shop and seen an old woman sitting on the bench in what appeared to be every piece of clothing she owned, and something in him had simply refused to keep walking. He had not made a decision about it. That was the thing he could never quite explain to himself. He had not stopped and weighed the cost against his budget and concluded that he could afford it. He had just stopped. He had stood there in the early dark with his hands in his pockets and looked at her, this slight, white-haired woman, sitting utterly still on a snow-dusted bench with a hospital blanket around her shoulders and a canvas bag between her feet, and something older than reason had moved in him, and he had gone and gotten the sandwich and brought it back, and she had taken it from him with both hands and said, simply, "Thank you. Sit down if you like." And he had not sat down because he had to get to the shop. But he had come back the next morning, and the morning after that. He came back every morning now. Bus stop 14 sat at the corner of Fenwick and Birch, half a block from Daniel's building, on the route that ran out to the textile plant and the hospital. The bench had a metal roof over it, 3-sided walls of plexiglass gone cloudy with age, and a map of the bus lines laminated in plastic and mostly illegible. In December, the bench was cold enough to hurt if you sat on it for more than 10 minutes. In January, it was worse. The woman had been sitting there through all of it. Her name was Eleanor Hayes. She had told him that on the 3rd morning, after he had shown up with a second sandwich, and she had looked at him for a long moment with her gray eyes that had the particular quality of someone who has spent a great deal of time watching things and learned not to announce what they see, and said, "You're not going to stop, are you? It was not quite a question. Probably not, Daniel had said. Eleanor Hayes, she said, and held out her hand. It was a formal gesture, oddly so. The way someone might introduce themselves at a function, not on a bench at 6 in the morning in a foot of snow. Daniel Carter, he said, and shook it. She had a grip that surprised him. He did not ask why she was living at a bus stop. This was partly because he had been raised by a grandmother who considered it rude to ask about things people had not chosen to share, and partly because Eleanor Hayes carried herself in a way that made such questions feel presumptuous. She was not, he sensed, a woman who had ended up here through carelessness or confusion. She sat on that bench the way a general might sit in a field tent, not comfortably, necessarily, but with authority, as though she had assessed her options and chosen this one. The choice to keep coming back was also not something he examined too closely. He was aware that he could not afford it. Technically, $4.25, 4 mornings out of 5, was $20 a week he did not have. He had made a rough calculation, early on, that involved cutting back on the coffee he bought for himself, on the way to the shop his one consistent indulgence, the large dark roast from the place on Clement that cost $2 more than the gas station alternative, and had decided that this trade was one he could live with. He was less certain about the emotional cost, which was harder to quantify. Eleanor Hayes was not easy, exactly. She was not warm in any conventional sense, did not offer reassurances, or deflect difficult silences with cheerful noise. Talking to her was more like talking to someone who genuinely heard what you said and took it seriously, which was rarer than it should have been, and sometimes more uncomfortable than being ignored. He had told her, once, about Claire. Not much, a few sentences. The outline of a thing rather than the thing itself. Claire had left when Lily was 2. She had moved progressively west Columbus, then Street, Louis, then Phoenix, as though the country itself were tilted in that direction. She was not, as far as he knew, a bad person. She was just a person who had found, when tested, that she was not built for this particular life, and had had the honesty to say so. He did not hate her. He had stopped being angry at her sometime around Lily's 4th birthday. What remained was something simpler and harder to name. The ordinary daily weight of doing everything alone. Eleanor had listened to all of this with her usual attention, the full, unhurried kind that never felt like waiting for your turn to speak. "You're tired," she said, when he'd finished. "Yes," he said. "Not of Lily. Never of Lily." She nodded. "That matters," she said. "More than you think." He had walked away from that conversation, not entirely sure why it had helped. Only that it had. She was, he guessed, somewhere in her mid-70s. She had white hair cut very short and practical, a thin face with good bones, and the kind of posture that in other contexts might be called military. Her hands were steady. Her voice was low and unhurried. She read, when the light was good enough, paperback novels mostly, and once a slim volume in a language he thought might be Russian, though he did not ask about that either. "You have a daughter," she said one morning in November. It was not a guess. Daniel had looked down at the front of his coat, where Lily had pressed a sticker that morning, a cartoon bear with a star, before he'd had a chance to stop her. "Lily," he said, 7 years old. Eleanor nodded. "They're the real age," she said. 7. He was not sure what she meant, and he did not ask, and somehow it settled in him anyway. Lily came with him on Saturdays. She was not a child who needed to be coaxed into things, which was one of the many ways in which she was easier to raise than Daniel had any right to expect. She took to Eleanor Hayes the way she took to most things that interested her directly, with a full accounting of her current opinions on the relevant subjects. The relevant subjects, when it came to Eleanor, were animals. Eleanor knew a great deal about birds, which impressed Lily considerably. The proper way to fold a foil wrapper so it could be used twice. Eleanor endorsed this practice without condescension. And whether the snow was the kind you could pack. "You can't pack powder," Eleanor told her one Saturday in late November, with the crisp delivery of someone stating a fact about physics. "You need wet snow." when the temperature's right at the edge. 32, Lily said. 32 exactly. Lily nodded, satisfied, and bit into her half of the breakfast sandwich. And Eleanor watched her with an expression that Daniel could only describe as fond and slightly rueful, the way you might look at something that reminded you of something you no longer had. Eleanor told stories. Not often. Not in the way of someone who needed to fill silence. She was deeply comfortable with silence, more so than anyone Daniel had ever met. But sometimes, on the slow mornings when the bus was late, and the three of them sat in the plexiglass shelter with the cold held just barely outside, she would begin a sentence in a tone that was slightly different from her usual tone, a tone with a little more distance in it, the way a person's voice changes when they're describing something they are not quite inside anymore. I worked for the government, she said once. For a long time. What kind of work? Daniel asked. She considered this. Analysis, she said, finally. Assessment. Reading situations and people and understanding them before they became problems. Intelligence, he said. She looked at him with those gray eyes for a moment. Then she said, among other things. He thought she was, perhaps, embellishing. He had no particular reason to think so. Her manner was never that of a person seeking sympathy or drama. But the alternative was that a former intelligence officer was living at a bus stop in Millhaven, Ohio, and his mind kept sliding off that possibility, the way a hand slides off wet glass. There are places, Eleanor said once, carefully, that don't appear on organizational charts. People whose names don't appear in directories. Work that gets done and is never spoken of, because speaking of it would make it impossible to continue. She looked out at the street. That's not glamour. That's just logistics. Do you have family? Lily asked her one Saturday, with the directness of 7. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. I did, she said. A sister. She died 8 years ago. We were not close, by the end. She paused. That's the kind of thing you don't fix in time. Lily considered this with great seriousness. My mom's in Arizona, she said. We don't see her. I know, Eleanor said. Daniel looked at her. She was watching Lily. He had not told her about Claire. December brought the worst of the cold. Daniel's finances reached the point he had been quietly dreading since October. A gap. Not a catastrophic one. Not yet Marcus had paid him. The Carver brake job had come through, but 2 jobs had fallen through in the same week, and the transmission rebuild he'd been counting on turned out to belong to a man who had decided to sell the car instead. And Daniel sat at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening after Lily was in bed and added up the numbers and found himself $60 short for the rent, due on the 15th, and $300 short for the car payment, due the 22nd. He stared at the numbers for a while. Then he went to bed, because staring at them longer would not change them, and in the morning he put on his coat and picked up the paper bag and went to bus stop 14. Eleanor was not there. He stood in front of the empty bench for a moment, confused in a way that felt disproportionate. He had never considered, not once in 6 months, that she might simply not be there. She was always there. She had been there in a nor'easter in October that had kept most of the town indoors. She had been there through wind chills of -15. He set the paper bag on the bench anyway, stood for a minute, looked both ways along Fenwick Street, as though she might appear at any moment from around a corner. She did not. He went to the shop and spent the morning turning rotors and trying not to worry, and told himself she had probably gone somewhere, a shelter. Maybe. Now that the cold was serious and would be back tomorrow. She was back 3 days later. She looked smaller. That was the first thing he noticed, and it frightened him in a way he wasn't prepared for. Because Eleanor Hayes did not look small, but she was thinner. And there was something around her eyes that had not been there before. Not pain exactly, but the residue of pain, the way a room looks after something difficult has happened in it. There was a surgical scar on her right hand, pink and recent, disappearing up into her sleeve. "Where were you?" he said, and his voice came out less neutral than he'd intended. "Hospital," she said. "Heart." Nothing they hadn't fixed before. She said this The way you might say traffic was bad factually, without performance. He sat down next to her. "Eleanor, I need to give you something," she said. She reached into the canvas bag at her feet and produced an envelope. White, letter-sized, sealed, no writing on the outside. She held it out to him with both hands. He took it. "If I'm not here one morning," she said, "and a day goes by, and then another, don't open that. Mail it. The address is inside, in a smaller envelope. Just put the whole thing in a bigger envelope and mail it." "What is it?" She looked at him steadily. "A letter," she said. "To someone who should know certain things. Eleanor, if you need help, medical help, housing, whatever I can, you've already helped me," she said. "More than you know. More than I'm going to explain to you right now." She reached over and took the breakfast sandwich from the bag he was still holding. "Now stop looking at me like that." He put the envelope in the inside pocket of his work coat, against his chest, where it stayed for the next 11 days. The cold deepened in January. Eleanor was there most mornings, not all of them. Twice, she was absent for a day, and Daniel spent the day distracted and guilty and relieved when she reappeared. But she was visibly less well than she had been in the fall. She moved more carefully. She sat in a way that suggested her body had become something she was managing rather than inhabiting. She did not complain. This was not, Daniel had come to understand, stoicism in the performative sense. It was just how she was. She had some relationship with physical difficulty that was different from most people's. Some accommodation reached long ago under circumstances he would never fully know. She told him other things. About a city he couldn't name that she described only by its weather and the sound of its streets. About a man she had once watched for 6 weeks without being seen, watching him eat breakfast every morning in a window seat of a cafe, watching the left-hand pocket of his coat, where he always reached for his phone when he received a particular kind of message, and about what had been prevented as a result. She told him about a night in winter, many years ago, when she had been alone in a place she was not supposed to be, and had made a decision in about 3 seconds that she had never fully unpacked, and had lived with the consequences of that decision ever since. "Were they good consequences?" Daniel asked. "For the people who got to keep living," she said. "Yes." He still was not sure how much of it was real. The city that couldn't be named, the man in the window seated, had the texture of reality, the specific sensory detail that invention usually lacks. But it also had the quality of something very old, handled so many times that the edges had worn smooth. There were other things, she said, that were harder to dismiss. One morning she told him, without preamble, the make and year of his car. He had never mentioned his car. It was parked around the block, not visible from the bus stop, and he had walked to the bus stop every morning he could remember. "Silver 2008 Civic," she said. "You replaced the rear brakes yourself, about 3 months ago. The rear passenger wheel has a slow leak, maybe 4 psi a week. You probably top it up on Thursdays." He stared at her. "Tuesdays," he said. She nodded. "Tuesdays." "I was close. How did you? I've been watching you walk to this bus stop for 6 months," she said, with the patience of someone explaining something obvious. "I watch everyone who passes. The calves of a person who changes tires tell you a great deal. The way you favor your left foot slightly, after standing for long periods, suggests a trade that involves standing in one position. The timing of your tread, the heel wear I could see when you first started coming, and the coat you were wearing then was shorter, is consistent with someone who has recently changed a habit related to their vehicle." She paused. "The wheel was a guess. A good guess. Most guesses are good if you pay enough attention first," she said. "You don't believe me," she said one morning. Not accusatory. Observational. "I believe you were in government work," he said, carefully. "I believe some of what you're describing." She nodded. "That's reasonable," she said. "I wouldn't believe me either." An old woman at a bus stop. "Convenient enough story. It's not that I think you're lying," he said. "It's more that the version of the world where it's true is hard to hold on to. It keeps sliding." "Yes," she said. "That's by design. A great deal of money and effort goes into making certain things hard to hold on to." She looked out at the street. A car went past. A man in a blue parka walked a dog without looking up. The bus did not come. Most people prefer it that way. It's more comfortable not to know the precise mechanisms by which certain things are kept stable. And you, he said, do you prefer it? She was quiet for a moment. The cold pressed against the plexiglass. I spent 31 years knowing the mechanisms, she said. Now I sit on a bench. A pause, and then something almost dry in her voice. I wouldn't say I prefer it. I would say I understand it. Then she looked at him with those gray eyes and said, "The envelope, Daniel." "Still have it," he said, and patted the inside of his coat. "Good." It was a Thursday in late January when Eleanor collapsed. Daniel was not there when it happened. A woman named Ruth Parsons, who worked the early shift at the hospital pharmacy and caught the 7:15 from bus stop 14 5 days a week, called 911 and stayed with Eleanor until the ambulance came. She described Eleanor later as having been calm, not the fragile calm of someone drifting in and out of consciousness, but the deliberate calm of someone who had assessed the situation and decided that panic would not improve it. Daniel found out because Ruth Parsons, not knowing who else to notify, had left a note on the bench. "The woman who sits here was taken to Street Catherine's this morning. He found it on Friday at 6 to 10 when he arrived with the paper bag. He drove to Street Catherine's before the shop opened. The emergency intake department was busy in the manner of all emergency intake departments in midwinter, not chaotic, but relentlessly occupied. Every seat taken, every staff member moving with the specific efficiency of people who have prioritized everything and are working through the list. Daniel waited at the desk for 12 minutes before a tired-looking triage nurse with a badge that said Vance looked up at him. "Eleanor Hayes," Daniel said. "She was brought in yesterday morning. Elderly woman, white hair. She was found at a bus stop on Fenwick. Are you family?" "No. I've been looking after her." He paused. "She doesn't have family." Vance looked at his screen. His expression shifted slightly, not from nothing to something, but from one kind of professional neutral to another, less comfortable kind. "There's a note on the file," he said slowly. "I can't. I'm not able to give you information about patients who aren't family. Is she alive?" A pause. "Yes." "Is she being treated?" Vance looked at the screen again. "There were some complications with the intake process," he said, carefully. "Her documentation was unusual." "What does that mean?" "It means the system flagged her file." He lowered his voice slightly. "Her records are, I've been doing this for 9 years, and I've never seen a patient file that looks like hers. Most of it is redacted. What isn't redacted has a reference code I've never encountered." He looked at Daniel. "One of the administrators made some calls this morning. I don't know who she reached." Daniel leaned on the desk. "Can I see her?" "She's stable," Vance said, and then seemed to make a decision. "Room 412. But I'm going to ask you to keep this between us." Room 412 was at the end of a hallway that smelled of antiseptic and heated air. Eleanor was in the bed closest to the window, which was fogged with condensation. She was connected to a cardiac monitor and an IV line, and she looked, if anything, slightly less alarming than she had on the worst mornings at the bus stop. Her color was better, the hollow look around her eyes had eased somewhat. She opened her eyes when he came in. "You found me," she said. "Someone left a note." "Ruth," Eleanor said, with what sounded like genuine appreciation. "Good woman." Daniel pulled the chair close to the bed. "They say your file is strange." Eleanor looked at the ceiling. "They would find it that way?" "Yes. Eleanor, I spent 31 years in a part of the government that officially does not exist," she said, with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. "When you leave that kind of work, they don't simply close your file. They manage it. For the rest of your life, your records are curated. In case you need to be found, or in case someone else needs to not be able to find you." A pause. "I believe what they found is what happens when a file has been managed for too long and the people doing the managing have retired," and their successors don't quite know what they inherited. What does that mean for your treatment? It means I need to be transferred to a VA facility, she said. Which should happen today, if whoever the administrator called has done her job. She was right. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, a transfer order had come through for Eleanor Hayes, authorizing her care at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Columbus, 45 minutes away. The paperwork, Vance told Daniel in the hallway with the expression of a man who has witnessed something he cannot explain, had come from a level of the hospital administration he had never seen move that quickly. Daniel drove to Columbus that evening. They would not let him see her. She was in an evaluation unit, but a nurse at the front desk told him she had arrived safely and was comfortable. He drove back to Millhaven and sat in the parking lot behind his building for a while before going up. The envelope was still in his coat. Eleanor died on the 8th of February, at 4:17 in the morning. The nurse who called Daniel, a man named Tim Garza, whose voice had the practiced gentleness of someone who makes these calls regularly, said she had passed peacefully, that her vital signs had been deteriorating for 36 hours, but that she had been conscious and coherent until the last several hours, and that she had left instructions about her personal effects. Daniel was listed, in those instructions, as next of kin. He had not known this. He drove to Columbus the next day and collected Eleanor Hayes's belongings from the storage room off the ward's family waiting area. They fit in a single cardboard box. A change of clothes, neatly folded, 3 paperback novels, a small canvas wallet containing $38, a library card, and a transit card. A photograph, black and white, of a young woman in military dress uniform standing very straight in front of a building he didn't recognize, looking directly into the camera, with an expression that was composed and formidable, and recognizably, Eleanor. On the back, in small handwriting, Fort Belvoir, 1974, first week, and a notebook, spiral-bound, water-stained, the covers warped and soft with age. He brought the box home and set it on the kitchen table, and sat with a cup of coffee that went cold while he read the notebook. It was not a diary. It had no dates, no personal reflections, none of the introspective machinery of private writing. It was, as far as he could determine, a record. A list of names and places and dates, written in a compressed shorthand that he could partially decode. There were codes he couldn't crack. There were references to events that he could not place. But there were also, interspersed, brief plain language notes that were legible to anyone. Asset confirmed in place. 3 weeks to operation. Situation resolved without diplomatic incident. Lives, 4 confirmed. Possibly more, no way to verify. 7 years on this assignment. No record anywhere. That is the point. He closed the notebook. He sat for a long time. The kitchen was quiet around him. Through the wall he could hear the faint sound of a television from the apartment next door, the Millers, an elderly couple who watched the news at high volume every evening, the anchor's voices rising and falling in the reliable rhythms of catastrophe and commercial break. The radiator knocked twice and went still. Lily's owl nightlight was visible through the gap in her half-open door, casting a soft orange glow into the hallway. He looked at the notebook again. He thought about what it meant that Eleanor Hayes had been carrying this for however many years, how long. He couldn't know through all the winters and the bus stops and the retreats from whatever life she'd had before. She had not destroyed it. She could have. A woman with her background would know how to ensure that certain documents did not survive. She had kept it, instead, in the bottom of the canvas bag that went everywhere with her, under the paperbacks and the wallet and the transit card, like a foundation stone. He thought about the briefness of the plain language entries. Lives, 4 confirmed. Possibly more, no way to verify. Whoever had written that, and it was Eleanor's handwriting, the same compressed, confident print she'd used on notes she'd pressed into his hand sometimes, messages so brief, they barely qualified as sentences, had not been writing for an audience, had not been making a record for posterity, had just needed to write it down somewhere. In plain words, as though the plainness were a form of honesty. This happened, it had weight, here is the weight recorded. He thought about the man in the window seat. 6 weeks of observation, the exact reach into the left pocket of the coat, the particular kind of message. He thought about what it would take to sustain that quality of attention for 6 weeks, to hold the focus while eating, while sleeping, while doing all the other things that constitute a life, never letting it slip, never letting your eye wander from the window and the pocket, and the man who did not know he was being watched. He thought about Eleanor Hayes on a bench in January, reading Russian, watching the street. He thought, of course, she watched the street. He thought about the way she had watched Lily, that particular quality of attention, fond and careful and slightly removed, as though she were observing something she valued at a safe distance. He thought about the surgical scar on her hand, pink and precise, the trace of a body that had been repaired and gone on and been repaired again. He thought about the envelope. He went and got it from the inside pocket of his work coat, where it had been for 63 days, and he carried it to the kitchen table and sat down and looked at it. He had promised to mail it. He had not promised to mail it immediately, but it was implicit. It had always been implicit. He thought about the VA ward and the transfer paperwork that moved at a speed that surprised a 9-year veteran of hospital administration. He thought about a file that was managed by people who didn't know what they'd inherited. He got an envelope from the junk drawer. He wrote the address from the inner envelope, a P.O. box, in Washington, D.C. No name, just a box number on the outside. He put Eleanor's envelope inside. He drove to the post office and mailed it before he could think about it any further. The 12 days between mailing the letter and the knock on the door were not eventful, externally. Internally, they were the longest 12 days Daniel Carter had experienced in several years. He worked. He fixed an oil pan gasket on a Subaru, finished the transmission rebuild that had been delayed by a parts backorder, took on 2 oil changes and a tire rotation. He replaced a cracked serpentine belt on a minivan belonging to a woman named Donna Hartley, who brought him a plate of oatmeal cookies and stood in the shop doorway asking questions about her car's maintenance history, with the focused anxiety of someone who has recently concluded that everything they own is about to fail, simultaneously. He was patient with her. He answered everything. When she left, he ate one of the cookies and thought about Eleanor Hayes, which he was doing several times an hour, in a way he could not seem to regulate. He made breakfast for Lily and walked her to the school bus and picked her up and made dinner and read to her and went through the school forms about the spring fundraiser, which wanted him to sell $42 worth of popcorn. He called his grandmother in Akron and talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular. He cleaned the bathroom. He recaulked the edge of the bathtub, which had been on the list for 2 months, because working on the apartment with his hands was the one thing that reliably stopped the inside of his head from being so loud. He did not go back to bus stop 14. He tried once, on the 4th day, and stood in front of it for about 30 seconds before he understood that he was not ready for the bench to be empty and went home. He told himself he would go again when it felt different. He was not sure when that would be. He took Eleanor's photograph and set it on the shelf above the kitchen table, between the coffee maker and the small clay bowl Lily had made in 2nd grade art class. He did not explain it to Lily. She had been told about Eleanor's death in the simple, direct terms that children deserve and respond to better than adults usually manage. Eleanor died, which means she isn't here anymore, but she was here for a long time, and she was a good person, and Lily had cried a little and then said, very seriously, we should visit the bench. They had not yet done this. Daniel thought they would, eventually. On the 12th day, at 11:40 on a Saturday morning, someone knocked on the door of the apartment on Fenwick Street. Daniel was in the kitchen. Lily was at the table behind him, doing a worksheet about fractions. He opened the door. 3 people stood in the hallway. 2 of them were in uniform dark service dress, the kind worn for formal occasions, not field work. A man in his 50s with a square jaw and the posture of someone who has stood at attention so many times it became the default. A younger woman, late 30s, whose bearing was equally precise. The third person was in civilian clothes, a dark coat, gray hair cut close, wire-framed glasses, carrying a leather folio under one arm. He was perhaps 65, and he had the kind of face that is not quite memorable until you look at it twice, at which point it becomes very memorable indeed. "Mr. Carter," the civilian said. I'm sorry to arrive without more notice. My name is Arthur Bledsoe. May we come in? They sat in the living room, which was not large, and had a child's drawings on the walls, and a carpet that was showing its age, and a couch that had been better. Lily, with instincts that Daniel had not known she possessed, looked up from her fractions, assessed the situation, said, "I'll be in my room," and went, taking her worksheet with her. The soldier, the woman, watched this, with an expression that was almost a smile, and then became perfectly neutral again. Arthur Bledsoe opened the folio on his knee. He did not look at what was in it as he spoke, which suggested he had said these things before, or something close to them. Eleanor Hayes served with the Defense Intelligence Agency from 1972 to 2003, he said, 31 years. Her final rank, which has never been formally retired, was Senior Intelligence Officer, which is a designation that has no equivalent in the public-facing military structure, and is therefore not something most people have heard of. He paused. During her career, she was principally involved in what we call human terrain analysis, the assessment of political and military situations through prolonged direct observation and personal contact, rather than signals or satellite intelligence. She was a spy, Daniel said. She was an analyst, primarily. She was also, when the situation required it, an officer in the field. The distinction matters less than it might seem. He looked down at the folio, finally, between 1983 and 1997. She was involved in the protection and intelligence support of 4 diplomatic figures and 1 sitting elected official during periods of acute personal risk. In 2 cases, the interventions she coordinated prevented what would, in our assessment, have been significant political violence. He turned a page. She was involved in the prevention of at least 1 incident that would, had it proceeded, have required a public diplomatic response, and potentially something further. The people involved in those decisions know what they owe. Daniel sat with this. She wrote about you, the woman in uniform said. It was the first time she had spoken. Her name, she had said when they came in, was Major Rebecca Stowe. In the letter, a page and a half which, for Eleanor Hayes, is considerable. She was not, Arthur Bledsoe said, a person who wrote about people lightly. What did she say? Major Stowe looked at Bledsoe. He nodded slightly. She said, Stowe said, that for the last 6 months of her life she was brought breakfast by a man who had nothing to spare and never mentioned it, that he brought his daughter on Saturdays, which was the best part of the week. She paused. She said that she had spent her career reading people, assessing their motives, their hidden interests, and what they wanted, and what they would do to get it, and that in all that time she had encountered very few people whose basic character she would assess as genuinely good, without complication or agenda. She said you were one of them. The room was quiet for a moment. She said to tell you, Stowe added, that she was not sentimental, and that this was a professional assessment. Daniel looked at the photograph on the shelf above the kitchen table. Eleanor Hayes, 23 years old, standing in front of a building at Fort Belvoir in 1974, looking directly into the camera with an expression that was composed and formidable and, if you looked at it long enough, not quite free of something softer underneath. She wanted me to know, Arthur Bledsoe said, more gently, that the things she told you were true, all of them. He did not understand, at first, the full shape of what they were offering. They spent another 40 minutes explaining it. There was a program. Bledsoe was careful with his language here, using bureaucratic phrasing that was not quite evasive but was not quite direct, either a program that existed for the families and designated beneficiaries of certain long-service officers whose careers could not be publicly acknowledged, and whose contributions had therefore never been formally compensated at the level they deserved. It was funded through channels that did not appear on public budgets. It was not charity. It was, as Bledsoe described it, an obligation one that the people who had benefited from Eleanor Hayes's work had long since agreed should be honored. The practical effect, for Daniel Carter, was this. The rent arrears on the apartment on Fenwick Street would be cleared. A fund had been established that would cover Lily's education through university. And there was an offer. Bledsoe was clear that it was an offer, not a requirement of a position with a small government-adjacent automotive maintenance contract that served a facility he was not permitted to know the name of, at a salary of $58,000 a year with full benefits. Daniel sat with this for a while. "Why?" he finally said. Bledsoe looked at him. "Pardon? Why me? She could have written that letter to anyone. She could have written it to you directly to whatever office you work for. She clearly had contacts. Why?" He stopped, started again. "She spent 6 months at a bus stop. She had a heart condition serious enough to need surgery. She had a VA file that could move paperwork in 45 minutes. Why was she at that bus stop?" Bledsoe was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor Hayes retired in 2003, he said, finally. She chose to retire. There were circumstances around that decision that I'm not going to detail. After she retired, she was offered support. She declined it." He folded his hands on the folio. "She declined it several times over several years, in terms that made it clear she was not going to be persuaded. Our assessment was that she had withdrawn, from the work, from the people associated with it, from everything. A pause. We lost track of her, in the practical sense, in 2019. We knew she was alive. We didn't know where." He looked at Daniel with an expression that was composed and careful and, underneath those things, something that looked like regret. "She chose the bus stop," he said. "We believe she chose it specifically. Specifically, the cold. Specifically, the difficulty. Specifically, the visibility." He paused. "She wanted to see who would stop." Daniel thought about a bench at 6 in the morning. An old woman sitting utterly still in the snow. A paper bag. A hand held out to shake. "You don't know who you're helping." "And?" he said. "And you stopped," Bledsoe said. "And kept stopping. And didn't ask for anything." A pause. Eleanor Hayes spent 31 years assessing people's character in high-pressure, high-stakes environments. She believed her view was that ordinary, low-stakes kindness was the most accurate indicator of actual character she had ever encountered. That what people do when nothing is required and nothing is on the line and no one is watching is what people actually are. He closed the folio. "She watched a lot of people walk past that bench. Mr. Carter. They left around 2 o'clock. Major Stowe, on her way to the door, paused and looked at Lily's drawings on the wall, a horse, a house, a figure in a yellow coat that was probably Daniel. She looked at them for a moment, with an expression he couldn't quite read. "She talked about your daughter," Stowe said. "In the letter." She looked at him. "She said she had a good laugh." After they left, Daniel stood in the living room for a long time. He was not entirely sure what he felt. There was something there that was not quite grief and not quite relief, some combination of the two that had been compressed together for too long and had taken on properties of neither. He thought about Eleanor Hayes and the way she had handed him the envelope with both hands. The formality of it. The weight she had given it, without making a performance of the weight. He went and knocked on Lily's door. She was on her bed with the rabbit and the fractions worksheet, which she appeared to have mostly finished. She looked up at him. "Who were those people?" she asked. "They were people who knew Eleanor," he said. He sat on the edge of her bed. "From when she was younger." "From her work." "What kind of work?" "Important work," he said. "The kind that doesn't get talked about." Lily considered this. "Like a secret?" "Kind of." She was quiet for a moment. "Is she famous?" "Not in the way most people would recognize," he said. "But she was. She did things that mattered." For a long time, Lily looked at the ceiling. "We should visit the bench," she said. "Yeah," he said. "We should. Can we go now?" He looked out her window. The snow had stopped overnight, and the sky was a pale winter blue, the kind that looks warmer than it is. The streets would be cold. They would need their coats. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go." They walked together down Fenwick Street in the early afternoon light. Lily with her hands in her pockets and her hat pulled down to her eyebrows, and her breath making small white clouds. Daniel carried the sandwich. He was not entirely sure why he had made it. Only that it had seemed right, and kept his hands in his pockets. The photograph of Eleanor Hayes was in the inside pocket of his work coat, against his chest, where the envelope had been. Bus stop 14 was quiet. The bench was empty. The plexiglass walls were furred with frost on the inside, and the bus map was barely visible, and the metal roof had a line of snow along its edge that would eventually fall or melt, and in the meantime just sat there, indifferent. Lily stood in front of the bench and looked at it for a while with the serious, full-attention look she brought to things that deserved it. "Do you think she liked it here?" she asked. "Really liked it, I mean. Not just stayed here." Daniel thought about this carefully. "Because it deserved care. I think," he said, "she understood it. What it meant. She was a person who paid attention to what things meant." Lily nodded. She reached over and took the sandwich from him. She had seen him make it. She had known it was not for either of them, and she set it on the bench. On the side where Eleanor had always sat, with the same two-handed, careful deliberateness that Eleanor herself had used to hand him the envelope. The cold was the same cold as always, pressing in at the collar and the cuffs, doing what cold does. But the sky was very blue, and the street was very quiet. And there was a sandwich on a bench in the thin winter light. And Lily slid her mitten into Daniel's hand, and they stood there together for a while before turning and walking home. Some things don't announce themselves. They don't come with music or context or any particular signal that they are the things that will matter. They're just a bench, a cold morning, a paper bag, a hand. They're just the moment when you stop. For no reason you can fully articulate, other than that not stopping seems wrong. Eleanor Hayes spent 31 years in rooms where very large things were decided. And she kept a notebook full of what those rooms had taught her. And at the end she went and sat in the cold to see who would stop. He stopped. That was all. It was enough.